Just as the anti-government protesters began to leave their protest yesterday from in front of SEB headquarters, a small explosive was thrown and gunshots were fired and people were injured, some of them seriously. Now, of course, you would expect this to be huge news, especially for the Western media and the local opposition media supporting the protests. You would expect them to immediately begin complaining about how, finally critics of the protests have finally resorted to violence. And at first, actually, that's what the media tried to do. This is Khao Sot, owned by billionaire opposition leader Thanaton's family, on Twitter saying, all eyes will be on the authorities tomorrow. Will they blame the protesters for inciting hatred from those who disagree? Or say it's time to enact special laws to keep order. Now, of course, Khao Sot is trying to say that, the government will try to frame this as the protesters made people angry, and that's why people are using violence against them. But as we'll see, that's completely untrue, because shortly after the violence, and ever since, media like Khao Sot went completely silent. All this morning, it was like nothing even happened at all. Why was that? Why the sudden silence? Because it turns out that it was the mob's own so-called security turning on each other over personal issues and fighting each other last night, even shooting at each other. We're told by the Western media and these fake human rights groups that these are peaceful, unarmed protesters, but here they are shooting at each other with guns that they apparently seem to have. So it wasn't people who disagreed with the protests who attacked them, and it wasn't the government or the police or the military. It was they themselves trying to kill each other. And think about this. These are people who want the current government to step down, and they want to run the country. And they can't even run a small protest for a few hours without it unraveling into violence and chaos. So keep that in mind. But let's get back to Khao Sot's initial reaction to the violence. If the government does enact special laws to keep order, it's going to be to protect the protesters from they themselves and to prevent their own violent members from killing each other or killing somebody else. Do you remember this sort of propaganda from the opposition? This was from Gao Mala, who claimed a great video segment about vocational students in Thai protests 2020. They were notorious for gang violence, but now they say Prayut has united them to fight for democracy. They form the majority of protest guards and enjoy much praise these days. Yeah, that was a bunch of propaganda. That was meant to convince the public of how progressive and powerful this movement was and how it was already, positively changing society. But of course, it was completely and obviously untrue. And here is Khao Sot. After police confirmed today that it was the protesters themselves turning on each other last night, that was where the violence came from. This is Khao Sot trying to cast doubt on that conclusion. But let's remember that Khao Sot didn't talk about this violence all morning specifically because they already knew that it was the protesters turning on each other, and they just didn't want to report it. They wanted to cover it up, just like the protesters wanted to cover it up. So, look, there's nothing genuine or sustainable about these mobs at all. The organizations behind them are all funded by the U.S. government. They've been caught lying repeatedly about that funding and their real agenda. The mobs are being egged on by the corrupt, billionaire-led opposition, who in turn seeks to just eliminate their enemies and work their way into power unopposed. And so all of these ideas about democracy and reform, this is just a smokescreen that they're doing all of this behind. And now people and movements like this often end up being their own worst enemies. And that's exactly what we're seeing playing out right now on the streets last night, in previous protests, and surely in protests soon to come. Yesterday, there were no police there. There were no counter protests. It was just the protesters themselves trying to kill one another. They've definitely become their own worst enemies at this point. So, look, if you feel frustrated with these mobs, if you feel angry about their attempts to divide and destroy this country, just be patient. Avoid the sort of ugliness and violence that is making these mobs themselves look so bad right now. And if you want to do anything about their violence, just keep exposing it, because the Western media, fake human rights groups, and the opposition media here in Thailand, like Khalsat, they can only keep trying to hide this for so long. Once the world understands the truth, it will untie the government, the police, and the military's hands to finally and fully deal with this problem. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share it. If you subscribe to the channel, it really helps it grow. And as always, thank you very much for watching.